The morning of December 7, 1941, began quietly in Pearl Harbor, the U.S. naval base tucked into the Hawaiian waters, almost idyllic in its calm. Sailors scrubbed decks, aircraft engines hummed in preparation for routine exercises, and officers carried out their morning inspections, unaware that history was about to erupt overhead in a way the world had never seen. Out of the blue, the first silhouettes appeared on the horizon, planes so swift, precise, and numerous that anyone witnessing them would later describe the scene as surreal. Within minutes, the tranquil naval base transformed into a theater of fire and smoke, as Japanese aircraft struck with ruthless efficiency. Battleships, destroyers, and aircraft lay in ruin, explosions ripped through hangars, and thousands of American servicemen found themselves fighting for survival before they could fully comprehend what had hit them. This was not just an attack, it was the shocking revelation of a power the Allies had severely underestimated: Japanese air power. The story of that morning did not start in Pearl Harbor, it had been decades in the making, beginning with Japan's recognition that control of the skies was essential to modern warfare. In the years leading up to World War II, Japanese military planners understood that the Pacific Ocean was vast, and any successful campaign would require air superiority over both land and sea. Unlike European powers, which focused heavily on armored vehicles and continental warfare, Japan invested in aircraft capable of long-range missions, coordinated strikes, and rapid deployment from aircraft carriers. This emphasis on flexibility and reach was matched by rigorous pilot training. Young aviators spent years mastering dogfighting techniques, precision bombing, and night navigation, making them among the most skilled in the world at the outbreak of war. Despite these preparations, Western observers, including military strategists in the United States and Britain, largely dismissed the threat. Reports of Japan's growing fleet of aircraft carriers and the capabilities of its pilots were often downplayed, misinterpreted, or outright ignored. Many believed that Japanese planes, though agile, were lightly built and poorly armored, and that their pilots lacked the experience to pose a serious threat against well-equipped Allied forces. This underestimation was compounded by racial prejudices and assumptions about industrial capacity. Some strategists assumed Japan could not sustain a prolonged air campaign because it lacked the manufacturing infrastructure of the United States or Germany. These assumptions, tragically, were proven catastrophically wrong within the first weeks of the Pacific War. The Japanese military's focus on maneuverability over armor was central to this misjudgment. Aircraft such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 were designed to be fast, nimble, and capable of executing tight turns, giving pilots a deadly advantage in dogfights. To Western analysts, the lack of protective armor seemed a vulnerability. They assumed a few well-placed hits would neutralize the aircraft. In reality, the Zero's superior maneuverability allowed it to avoid enemy fire, outpace heavier Allied planes, and strike targets with alarming precision. Coupled with coordinated tactics emphasizing surprise, massed attacks, and rapid execution, these planes could wreak havoc on unprepared opponents. The underestimation extended beyond technical assessments to tactical assumptions. Allied commanders often believed that Japan would strike cautiously, avoiding major confrontations until they had secured forward bases. They did not anticipate audacious operations like Pearl Harbor, where more than 350 aircraft launched from 6 carriers struck simultaneously, crippling nearly an entire fleet before the United States could effectively respond. Intelligence failures compounded the problem. Despite signals, reports, and reconnaissance indicating Japanese preparations, decision-makers either underestimated the scale of the threat or misinterpreted the information. This pattern repeated in other early campaigns, from the Philippines to Malaya, where Japanese air dominance allowed rapid, devastating advances. The consequences of this underestimation were immediate and far-reaching. In addition to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese air forces quickly demonstrated their ability to strike across Southeast Asia. Air superiority enabled Japan to provide close support to advancing ground troops, disrupt Allied supply lines, and secure key territories with minimal resistance. During the fall of Singapore in February 1942, for example, Japanese aircraft dominated the skies, allowing infantry and armor units to move with relative impunity. Similar strategies facilitated the swift conquest of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. Allied forces, initially confident in their defenses, were caught off guard by the speed, coordination, and reach of Japanese air operations. The effectiveness of these campaigns highlighted a central truth: neglecting the training, skill, and tactical ingenuity of an opponent can lead to catastrophic losses, regardless of technological assumptions. Training was a decisive factor in Japan's early successes. Pilots were selected from a rigorous pool and drilled in simulated combat scenarios that emphasized teamwork, split-second decision-making, and coordinated maneuvers. These exercises ensured that crews could operate in complex formations, maintain communication under duress, and adapt quickly to changing conditions. By contrast, many Allied units were still experimenting with air combat doctrine and struggled to integrate air operations with naval and ground forces. This discrepancy in preparedness contributed to initial Japanese victories and reinforced the false perception among Allied planners that Japan's apparent industrial limitations would eventually curtail its effectiveness. In practice, the combination of training, discipline, and aggressive tactics allowed Japan to offset many material disadvantages. Beyond skill and training, Japan's strategic use of aircraft carriers amplified its reach. Unlike land-based operations, which were constrained by geography and infrastructure, carrier-based aviation allowed Japan to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. Coordinated strikes could be launched against distant targets with minimal warning, leaving defenders scrambling to respond. The Pearl Harbor attack epitomized this approach: a calculated, precise strike delivered across the vast Pacific, relying on carriers to bring planes within range while preserving the element of surprise. The success of this operation stunned the United States and forced a rapid re-evaluation of Allied assumptions about Japanese capabilities. By the end of 1941, it became painfully clear to the Allies that underestimating Japanese air power had been a critical miscalculation. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor, coupled with rapid Japanese advances in Southeast Asia, exposed weaknesses in Allied intelligence, planning, and appreciation of the enemy's tactical strengths. Lessons would be learned the hard way: aircraft cannot be judged by armor alone, pilot skill can outweigh numerical disadvantage, and strategic audacity can offset logistical limitations. The failure to account for these factors would shape the early years of the Pacific War, forcing the United States, Britain, and their allies to rebuild, retrain, and rethink the role of air power in modern conflict. The narrative of December 7, 1941, and the subsequent months of early Japanese success serves as a cautionary tale for military planners and historians alike. It highlights the danger of assumptions based on incomplete data, the importance of respecting the skill and innovation of opponents, and the devastating consequences that follow when air power is underestimated. Japan's initial dominance in the air demonstrated that the combination of training, tactics, and audacity could overcome perceived technological deficiencies, creating an advantage that reshaped the course of the Pacific theater. More than a tactical lesson, it was a strategic awakening. The war in the sky was not an optional theater, it was a decisive arena in which the fate of nations could be determined. By mid-1942, as the Allies began to adjust to the threat, the true scope of Japan's air capabilities was fully recognized. Aircraft carriers, highly trained pilots, and innovative tactics had forced an urgent reconsideration of Allied strategy. The lesson of early Japanese air dominance would resonate throughout the Pacific campaigns, influencing battle planning, pilot training, and the allocation of resources. It became clear that underestimating Japanese air power was not merely an error in judgment, it had been a profound misreading of an adversary whose skill, ambition, and audacity had temporarily reshaped the balance of the war. Lightning strikes, early Pacific campaigns. The dawn of December 8, 1941, across the international date line, marked a new chapter in the Pacific theater. While the world still reeled from the shock of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces were already executing simultaneous offensives across Southeast Asia. From the dense jungles of Malaya to the scattered islands of the Philippines, Japanese aircraft carved paths of destruction that few Allied commanders had anticipated. The Allies had assumed that Japan's air power would be limited, hindered by geography and industrial capacity, but reality struck with a force that left little room for denial. Airfields were destroyed before ground forces arrived, supply lines were cut, and resistance crumbled under the weight of precision bombing and relentless strafing runs. It was a campaign defined not by massive numbers of aircraft alone, but by tactical ingenuity, audacity, and impeccable coordination between air, sea, and land forces. In Malaya, the Japanese air offensive began with a calculated shock. On December 8, hundreds of bombers and fighters swept across the skies, striking British airfields, bridges, and communication hubs. Allied forces had expected attacks primarily at ports and major cities, leaving northern and inland airstrips vulnerable. Japanese pilots executed dive bombing and low-altitude strafing with deadly precision, systematically neutralizing the few planes that could have mounted a defense. British commanders, accustomed to European theaters where air superiority could be contested more evenly, were stunned. The nimbleness of Japanese aircraft, combined with pilot skill honed over years of rigorous training, meant that even technically inferior Allied planes were rendered almost useless. Supply convoys along Malayan roads were attacked relentlessly, slowing reinforcements and creating chaos in a region that depended on coordinated logistics. The Philippines faced a similar fate. On the morning of December 8, Japanese carrier-based bombers struck Clark Field and other key air bases before Allied aircraft could scramble. Bombs tore through runways, hangars, and fuel depots, crippling the American Far East Air Force before it could mount effective resistance. Japanese pilots demonstrated not only technical skill but a clear understanding of operational psychology. The strikes were precise, coordinated, and designed to destroy both equipment and morale. The result was immediate. American and Filipino forces were forced to operate under constant aerial threat, unable to establish safe zones for staging or resupply. The absence of air cover meant that Japanese ground forces could advance with minimal resistance, supported by continuous reconnaissance and bombing runs that targeted any sign of defensive consolidation. Across the Dutch East Indies, Japanese air power played an equally decisive role. Islands like Java, Sumatra, and Borneo fell quickly because Allied air forces were scattered and underprepared. Japanese bombers destroyed ports, sabotaged oil facilities, and suppressed attempts to organize coherent air defense. Pilots flew long-range missions from carriers and captured airfields, demonstrating logistical skill that allowed the Japanese to maintain continuous sorties even hundreds of miles from their base. By neutralizing air opposition early, the Japanese ensured that ground and naval operations could proceed almost unhindered, creating a domino effect of rapid territorial gains. Resistance became largely symbolic, as small units were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of Japanese strikes. The early months of the Pacific War revealed critical flaws in Allied assumptions about Japan. Commanders in London, Washington, and Canberra had consistently believed that Japanese air forces would be constrained by limited industrial output and a shortage of trained pilots. They expected Japan to rely on numbers rather than skill, assuming that Allied technological superiority would eventually offset Japanese advantages. The reality was starkly different. Japanese aircraft were often lighter and less armored than Allied planes, but their maneuverability and pilot proficiency allowed them to dominate engagements. Even when Allied planes outnumbered Japanese formations, poor coordination, inadequate training, and underestimation of enemy tactics often led to decisive losses. In effect, the Allies had assumed that numerical and technological superiority alone would suffice, underestimating the importance of human skill and strategic innovation. A defining aspect of Japanese success was their emphasis on integrated operations. Air campaigns were not isolated missions, they were tightly coordinated with naval and ground maneuvers. Bombing raids cleared landing zones for amphibious operations, targeted artillery positions, and provided reconnaissance for advancing troops. Carrier-based aircraft enabled attacks far from Japanese home islands, extending their operational reach across thousands of miles of ocean. In contrast, Allied forces were often hampered by fragmented command structures, poor communication, and the slow adaptation of combined arms tactics. This gap in strategic approach allowed Japanese air power to achieve disproportionately high effects relative to its size, reinforcing the perception that Japan could strike decisively anywhere in the Pacific. The psychological impact of early Japanese air campaigns was as significant as the physical destruction. The speed and precision of the strikes created a sense of inevitability among Allied troops and local populations. Soldiers who had trained for months or years in preparation for conventional warfare found themselves facing an enemy who struck from the skies with overwhelming coordination. Civilians in urban centers and port towns witnessed air raids with almost no warning, often leading to mass evacuations and panic. This fear factor, combined with actual losses, disrupted not only military planning but also social cohesion, amplifying the strategic advantage of Japanese air operations beyond mere numbers or technology. By mid-1942, after the rapid fall of Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and parts of the Dutch East Indies, Allied planners were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: Japanese air power was a central pillar of their early wartime success. Initial assumptions about limited capabilities, reliance on surprise, or industrial inferiority had been catastrophically incorrect. The Allies realized that countering Japanese advances would require more than new aircraft. It demanded retraining pilots, developing new tactics, improving intelligence, and coordinating air-sea-land operations on an unprecedented scale. These lessons, learned through bitter experience, would shape the subsequent Allied strategy across the Pacific for the next 3 years. The campaigns of late 1941 and early 1942 serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of underestimating an adversary. Japan's combination of pilot expertise, tactical innovation, and audacious strategy allowed it to seize vast territories in record time. Allied overconfidence, incomplete intelligence, and reliance on outdated assumptions about Japanese industrial and military capability amplified the effectiveness of these strikes. The result was not just territorial conquest, but a psychological shockwave that forced the Allies to rethink the very nature of air power and its role in modern warfare. What began as a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor had become a template for a series of devastating campaigns, demonstrating that neglecting an enemy's human and tactical strengths can lead to catastrophic outcomes even in the presence of superior technology and resources. Turning the tide, Coral Sea and Midway. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific theater had settled into a deadly rhythm. Japanese aircraft still dominated the skies, yet cracks were beginning to show in their apparent invincibility. Allied forces, initially staggered by the speed and precision of Japanese air campaigns, had begun a painful process of adaptation. Naval commanders and air strategists had learned through bitter experience that surviving and countering Japanese air power required innovation, coordination, and a willingness to abandon outdated assumptions. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway became the first major tests of this new approach, revealing both the dangers of previous underestimation and the possibilities for turning the tide. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea unfolded as the first carrier versus carrier engagement in history. Intelligence reports had hinted at a Japanese advance toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, but Allied commanders could not afford to underestimate the threat. Unlike previous encounters, Allied forces, primarily American and Australian, coordinated naval and air operations with unprecedented care. Aircraft from carriers were launched to intercept Japanese formations hundreds of miles from their targets. For the first time, air combat extended beyond the immediate battlefield into a complex strategic interplay, where reconnaissance, timing, and decision-making became as decisive as the planes themselves. The engagement demonstrated that Japanese pilots, while still highly skilled, could be countered when Allied forces employed superior coordination and situational awareness. The Coral Sea battle highlighted critical lessons about both strengths and limitations of Japanese air power. Japanese aviators remained deadly, demonstrating remarkable precision in bombing runs and fighter coordination. However, the battle exposed vulnerabilities, particularly when pilots faced well-prepared intercepting forces or when intelligence provided the Allies with actionable warnings. The damage inflicted on Japanese carriers Shokaku and Ziwikaku slowed their operational tempo and forced a reassessment of offensive plans. For the Allies, the battle was technically a draw, but strategically, it marked a turning point. Japan's advance toward Port Moresby had been halted, and the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air had begun to crack. Just a month later, the decisive Battle of Midway cemented the consequences of understanding, rather than underestimating, Japanese air capabilities. By June 1942, intelligence breakthroughs, including the breaking of Japanese naval codes, allowed the United States to anticipate and counter the Japanese plan to seize Midway Atoll. Instead of reacting blindly to enemy movements, Allied commanders prepared ambushes, strategically placing carriers and aircraft to exploit Japanese strengths and weaknesses. When Japanese aircraft attacked, they encountered a defensive network designed specifically to challenge their assumptions of uncontested dominance. Despite the extraordinary skill of Japanese pilots, the combination of intelligence, timing, and improved coordination allowed Allied forces to sink 4 Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in a single engagement, altering the balance of naval and air power in the Pacific. Midway revealed several key truths. First, Japanese air power, while formidable, was not invulnerable. Even elite pilots could be overwhelmed by well-coordinated defenses, surprise counterattacks, and superior positioning. Second, intelligence was a force multiplier. Accurate information allowed Allied planners to anticipate attacks, place aircraft in optimal positions, and avoid the disastrous overextension that had characterized earlier campaigns. Third, the effectiveness of air power depended not only on the skill of pilots but on the strategic use of carriers, coordination with supporting forces, and the integration of intelligence into operational planning. The lesson was clear: underestimating the opponent is as dangerous as overestimating one's own strength. Following Midway, Japanese air operations shifted from unchecked expansion to a defensive posture. The loss of carriers limited Japan's ability to project air power over long distances, forcing reliance on land-based airfields and smaller, more vulnerable formations. Allied forces seized this opportunity, expanding training programs, increasing aircraft production, and developing new tactics to exploit the limitations of Japanese aircraft. Planes like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were designed to counter the maneuverability of Japanese fighters, while coordinated dive bombing and torpedo attacks targeted both ships and airfields. Allied pilots trained to anticipate Japanese techniques, learn the patterns of enemy attacks, and strike decisively when opportunities arose. The combination of superior numbers, improved technology, and hard-earned experience began to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. At the same time, Japanese forces faced internal challenges that compounded the effects of earlier misjudgments by the Allies. Experienced pilots had been lost in previous campaigns, leaving replacements who, though technically proficient, lacked the same level of combat experience. Fuel shortages, logistical strains, and the sheer scale of Allied production further eroded Japan's capacity to sustain prolonged air dominance. In contrast, the Allies were entering a period of exponential growth in aircraft production, pilot training, and carrier deployment. The gap between initial Japanese success and subsequent vulnerability highlighted the critical importance of human resources, training, and industrial capacity alongside raw skill and tactical ingenuity. Despite the growing effectiveness of Allied air strategies, Japanese aircraft remained a serious threat throughout 1942. Their ability to coordinate strikes, support naval operations, and execute rapid, flexible attacks ensured that no theater in the Pacific was entirely secure. Allied forces could not afford complacency. Every campaign from Guadalcanal to New Guinea required careful planning, constant reconnaissance, and aggressive adaptation to Japanese tactics. Yet the psychological impact of the Coral Sea and Midway victories was profound. These engagements demonstrated that Japanese air power, while formidable, could be challenged, mitigated, and ultimately defeated when preparation, intelligence, and coordination were applied effectively. The period following Midway also highlighted an evolving understanding of the interplay between air, sea, and land operations. Allied commanders realized that aircraft alone could not guarantee victory. They were most effective when integrated into a larger operational framework that included naval artillery, amphibious assaults, and logistical support. Conversely, Japanese successes earlier in the war had relied precisely on this integration, combining air strikes with carrier mobility and rapid ground advances. By replicating this model while leveraging superior resources and intelligence, the Allies were able to begin eroding the earlier advantages enjoyed by Japanese air power, turning lessons learned into actionable strategy. By the end of 1942, the Pacific had become a theater of attrition where Japanese air dominance was no longer assured. The early months of rapid expansion had demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of skilled pilots, surprise tactics, and coordinated strikes. But Coral Sea and Midway proved that underestimation carried a heavy price, and that preparation, intelligence, and adaptation could shift the balance. Japanese air power remained a formidable opponent, yet the Allies had demonstrated for the first time that it could be countered decisively, a revelation that would guide the remainder of the Pacific campaigns, shaping the conduct of battles, the allocation of resources, and the development of air strategy for years to come. Decline and legacy, the fall of Japanese air dominance. By 1943, the Pacific theater had entered a grueling phase that would define the eventual outcome of the war in the region. The early months of Japanese expansion, marked by rapid victories fueled by superior training, surprise attacks, and tactical innovation, had given way to a sustained struggle in which the Allies were no longer the passive victims of aerial supremacy. Japanese air power, once feared for its speed, precision, and audacity, began to show signs of strain under the relentless pressure of Allied adaptation, technological advancement, and industrial superiority. The period from 1943 to 1945 became a test not only of machines and pilots, but of the strategic capacity to sustain long-term operations in the harsh expanse of the Pacific. The turning point for Japan's air forces was the attrition of experienced pilots. In the early campaigns, these aviators had executed near-perfect coordination in offensive strikes across Pearl Harbor, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Their skill had allowed Japanese aircraft to outperform Allied planes despite lighter armor and less firepower. However, as battles stretched across New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Central Pacific, casualties mounted. Replacement pilots, though trained, often lacked the combat experience required for complex aerial engagements against increasingly skilled and better equipped Allied opponents. This loss of institutional knowledge gradually eroded the effectiveness of Japanese air operations, particularly in high-stakes encounters where split-second decision-making was crucial. At the same time, technological innovations by the Allies began to counter the previously unmatched maneuverability and range of Japanese aircraft. The introduction of the F-6F Hellcat, F-4U Corsair, and P-38 Lightning provided Allied pilots with planes that could match or exceed the Zero in speed, armament, and durability. These aircraft were specifically designed to exploit Japanese weaknesses, such as minimal armor protection, limited self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural vulnerabilities. Allied pilots employed coordinated flight tactics, diving attacks, and energy-based combat strategies that neutralized the advantages of Japanese maneuverability. Battles in the Solomon Islands, particularly around Guadalcanal, demonstrated that superior pilot numbers, reinforced by advanced aircraft, could offset even the skill disparity that had favored Japanese aviators earlier in the war. The logistical and industrial strain on Japan further compounded the decline of its air power. As the Allies gained momentum in island-hopping campaigns, Japanese forces were forced to operate from increasingly isolated airfields, often with inadequate fuel, maintenance, and spare parts. Carrier losses at Midway and subsequent naval engagements reduced the ability to project air power over vast distances, while Allied bombing raids disrupted domestic aircraft production. Japan's industrial base, limited in scale compared to that of the United States, struggled to replace both planes and pilots. Every engagement became increasingly costly, and incremental losses could not be offset by rapid reinforcement, gradually diminishing the strategic flexibility that had characterized the early war period. Allied tactics evolved not only to exploit Japanese weaknesses but also to maximize intelligence and coordination. By mid-1943, radar stations, reconnaissance flights, and code breaking had provided the Allies with detailed information about Japanese air movements, base locations, and fleet dispositions. This intelligence allowed for preemptive strikes, ambushes, and the concentration of superior forces at decisive points. For example, the campaign in the Solomon Islands relied heavily on the integration of naval aviation with ground operations, ensuring that air attacks supported the advance of troops while simultaneously targeting Japanese airfields and supply depots. This approach gradually forced Japanese pilots into reactive, defensive roles, undermining the initiative that had made them so dangerous in 1941–42. The psychological toll on Japanese aviators was equally significant. Early victories had fostered confidence and, in some cases, overconfidence. However, repeated exposure to superior Allied forces, combined with the knowledge that replacements lacked experience and that reinforcements were limited, created stress, fatigue, and a sense of inevitability. Pilots who once struck terror with their precision bombing and dogfighting were increasingly aware that each sortie carried disproportionate risk. Morale, which had once fueled audacious operations across the Pacific, now became a critical factor in operational performance. Losses at battles such as the Philippine Sea, famously dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot due to the scale of Japanese aircraft losses, underscored the cumulative effect of attrition on both material and human resources. By late 1944, Japan's capacity to launch large-scale offensive air campaigns had effectively collapsed. Allied air dominance allowed for the safe transport of troops, materials, and supplies across contested regions. Carrier raids, close air support, and strategic bombing campaigns increasingly fell under Allied control, while Japanese aircraft were relegated to desperate defensive missions, often unsupported and poorly coordinated. The decline was not sudden but marked by a gradual erosion of initiative, skill concentration, and operational reach. Where once Japanese planes had defined the tempo and direction of battles, they now struggled to mount effective resistance against the increasingly coordinated and technologically advanced Allied forces. The legacy of Japanese air power, however, extended beyond mere numbers or victories. The early years of World War II in the Pacific demonstrated that tactical skill, audacity, and coordination could achieve temporary supremacy even against a numerically and technologically superior opponent. The initial underestimation of Japanese aviation by the Allies had forced a re-evaluation of air strategy, intelligence gathering, and pilot training. By highlighting the importance of well-trained crews, flexible tactics, and integrated operations, Japan's early successes indirectly shaped the evolution of Allied air doctrine. Carrier warfare, the use of radar, and coordinated land-sea air campaigns were all refined in response to the lessons learned from combating Japanese air power. In retrospect, the rise and fall of Japanese air dominance offer critical insights into the nature of modern warfare. Initial victories were the product of innovation, training, and operational daring, while decline resulted from industrial limitations, attrition of experienced personnel, and the relentless adaptation of an intelligent adversary. The narrative underscores a timeless lesson: underestimating an opponent, particularly in terms of skill and tactical ingenuity, carries immediate and potentially catastrophic consequences. Yet, strategic foresight, resource mobilization, and adaptive tactics can reverse even the most formidable early advantages, highlighting the dynamic interplay between human skill, technology, and organizational resilience. By the final months of the war in 1945, Japanese air forces were shadows of their former strength. Allied bombers and fighters operated with near impunity over contested regions, while Japanese pilots faced severe shortages and dwindling morale. Yet the early campaigns remained a testament to what can be achieved through skill, planning, and audacity, reminding both historians and military strategists that dominance in the air is never guaranteed and must be continually earned, defended, and adapted. The story of Japanese air power in World War II is therefore both a cautionary tale and a lesson in strategic evolution. Early brilliance may illuminate the battlefield, but sustained success requires adaptation, resources, and resilience in the face of relentless opposition.